So our topic this evening is the Ridge, which is one of the terms used to describe that road that ran from Glens Falls up to ultimately to Lake George. We started out a couple years ago thinking that we would want to actually create a tour that people could take in Queensbury. We've done a lot of walking tours in Glens Falls. And if we're talking about Queensbury, essentially we're talking about rural roads. And we discovered in the process of doing the research that it could be a little dangerous to be stopping along roads like Ridge Road. The traffic many places is traveling at 55 or more miles per hour. And so before I go any further, I want to just take a moment to recommend to people that you not actually go along the road and stop and get out of your car to look closer at houses. It's dangerous. So please don't do that. It's okay to slow down a little bit. If you want to do it on a bicycle where you can be in more control, that would be fine too. But I also want to ask that you respect the privacy of the homeowners that live along Ridge Road. Please do not go onto their properties and certainly don't peek into their houses. We want to respect their privacy. So with that, let's start our tour. We're going to start in Glens Falls. And I'm going to include a few of the buildings that you might have seen if you were traveling north along Ridge Street in the city limits. One of the first ones you might notice is the Friends Meeting House. Here's a photograph of the congregation taken in 1878. It actually, I believe, is the third meeting house that the local Friends community had. The first one being on Bay Road. Then they moved to another place on Ridge, corner Ridge and Cronin, which we'll see in a couple minutes, and built a meeting house there, which they also outgrew, and then built this one here on Ridge. The building is still there. It has a different use now. And one thing I wanted to mention with it that it actually is pretty decorative for a Friends meeting house. You'll notice all of the architectural details on the building, but it really represented how established the Quaker community was by the 1870s here in Glens Falls and Queensbury. Going a little bit further up Ridge Street on the left-hand side is another place. Here's the Birdsall House, which is a house that would have been built late 19th century in Glens Falls, and it's going to be very different from some of the houses that we'll see as we move further up the road, which were built much earlier. This is a good example of what was popular in the late 19th century. Pardon, my dog is having a little fit here. You'll notice the shingle style and asymmetrical features of the building, the roof, many different roof lines on it. It's a mix of shingle and stone. This building too is still standing. It's now apartments, but it's located on the corner of Ridge and William. And the reason why I included it is just, if you see, it's really a lot of space around it. So it was a very different scene as you were traveling up Ridge Street in the late 19th century. As we get closer to the city limits, this was the Glens Falls Dairy. As you can tell from this, it's an early 20th century photograph because you can see the vehicles that they used to collect milk at that time period. But again, if you look at the photograph, you'll see that it's quite open space around this building. And much of what exists now within the city limits was built in later years. It was filled in around these buildings that existed at that time. What I'm going to do as we make our way up Ridge Road is that occasionally I'm going to intersperse a map. This is an 1876 map that shows Ridge Road. It was part of an atlas that was published at that time. What's really, I think, nice about these maps is they indicate who actually owned or occupied the properties that exist along the road. So I'll include them here and there, including some other maps from different time periods as well, so we can see some of the changes. I mentioned the Friends Meeting House as we were going by it earlier, and at the corner of Ridge and Cronin Roads, you'll find the cemetery, the Friends Cemetery, that still exists at that location. The meeting house that was there was, of course, they stopped using it when they moved to their new church further down Ridge Road in Glens Falls. And in the early 20th century, around 1910, that building was actually moved up the road to Oneida to become what is now the Oneida Community Church. So it was repurposed to be another church. You see, that's where the first red arrow is as we're moving up. And then the second one points to an area that we're going to be spending a couple minutes looking at. It's a little cluster of buildings, many of which are quite early. So with no further ado, here's the Quaker burial grounds that I mentioned. And here is a house that's usually referred to as the Tripp-Havilland house. By 1786, James Tripp had built one of the earliest wood frame houses in Queensbury on this site. In 1800, he sold it to Asa Stour for $750. He owned it only for a few years before selling it again, and those owners then turned around and sold it to Joseph Haviland. The 1855 census indicates that there was a brick house on this location, and that's the building we're looking at right here. And this house remained in the Haviland family until 1935. So it was through a few generations. And I want to advance the next one. Here is actually part of the house, which you can see from a different direction. And this probably is actually earlier construction. The dating of it is a little uncertain. It could certainly predate. Here you can see above the door, there's a date of 1790. We know there's a wood structure here prior to the brick house. That's certainly a strong possibility. You know, short of doing a lot of analysis on some of the features of the building, it would be hard to verify that with certainty. A little bit about the family people who lived there. Dr. Asa Stour was born in 1769, and he grew up along the New York-Massachusetts border. At age 21, he finished his studies, and he started out to seek his fortune with a horse saddle and bridle and a pair of saddlebags filled with medicine. He arrived in Queensbury in 1790, became the town's first physician, and later operated a medical school from his next home, which was further out the road. He died in 1848. One of the buildings that catches everybody's attention as they're traveling up Ridge Road is this stone building on the right-hand side of the road across from the Tripp House. It originally was built as a storehouse for storing grain or other materials that people wanted to be able to protect. You'll notice it has that doorway on the second floor, which would have made it easy for them to load materials in and out from wagons. It's typically what you'd see on a building that was being used for a granary or a feed store. So that certainly is probably true. In later years, it became a tenant house, and it's been used for many years. It's just a residence at this point. It's interesting, for many locals, they refer to this particular S curve as Dead Man's Curve, which is certainly a popular term that's used in many communities around the country for dangerous locations. I've talked to the family that live in this building now, and they shared with me that often there is an accident a year that occurs at this location. And I guess it's fortunate that this building is actually made of stone from all of the cars that have lost control in the area. It's known as the Newman granary. It was originally part of the Havilland farm. It was built around 1830. Across the road and on the left-hand side is the Anson Staples house. Anson was born in Danby, Vermont in 1825. He settled in Queensbury in 1850 when he married Lydia Ann Havilland, and her father, Joseph, who I mentioned before, gave the couple this property, which also included the barn across the street. It was a wedding gift. So here's the barn. In 1883, the farm consisted of 134 acres, which was pretty sizable for that time period. And members of the Havilland family lived in this building for another 80 years. So in addition to including photographs of buildings that are standing now, I looked through our database for historic photographs of some buildings that are no longer there or have been moved or drastically altered. And one thing we have is a nice set of photographs of some of the rural schools in Queensbury from the very early 20th century. This one here is referred to the Sanford's Ridge School, which threw me for a loop at first because Sanford's Ridge Road, of course, is not here. This is actually located or was located right on the corner of Ridge and Hicks Road. And it was the local school for that area. Kids would come from all around. And what I learned is at the time that it received this name, Sanford's Ridge essentially referred to that entire area, the height of land that now encompasses Chestnut Ridge Road, as well as this area of Ridge Road. Oh, I do have one little tidbit of information about it. In 1855, the school, which was new at that time, was valued at $419. Here in the 1876 map, you can see the area that was referred to as Sanford's Ridge. The arrow in the center is pointing to the intersection of Ridge and Hicks. And then you can see by the second arrow that's pointing out what is now Chestnut Ridge Road heading off to the northeast. There are a couple more houses that we're going to look at in this area before we proceed on. And the next one is, I refer to it as the Sanford House. And you can see the barn that is further along the road, which was built by actually the Havilland family later. So the Sanfords. In 1795, David Sanford, who was 26 at the time, moved to the area from New Milford, Connecticut with his wife, Amy, and 2 daughters at the time. They subsequently had more children. And they settled at this intersection of Ridge and Chestnut Ridge Road. In addition to a farm, he operated a store, an ashery, a smokehouse in the vicinity. And his father and mother joined them as well. and needing more space than their original small house, they built this federal style home around 1802. It's a wood frame house. And one of the things that's quite distinctive about it is the Palladian window that's over the central entrance. That was definitely a unique feature that you didn't find in many houses in the area, but would have been certainly very popular in Connecticut, where they came from. They certainly offer a design detail, which makes the house look special, but that window also allows a lot of light into the second floor hall. So it offers a functional advantage as well. During the War of 1812, Sanford provided supplies to soldiers that were stationed in the area, and he somehow contracted spotted fever, which is a mysterious disease, which not much is known about it, but at that time it struck communities in this area of New York and Vermont. And he died then at age 43. In 1855, the Sanford family sold it to David Havilland, who had actually married into the family. And the large barn to the north that is still standing there was built around 1870 by Willis Havilland, a descendant. Here is another building which is no longer here, but we have this wonderful historic photograph of it, so I wanted to include it. This is the house of Daniel Havilland. It's about a mile up Chestnut Ridge Road, or it was, I should say. And there is a great story told about its construction. It's built of brick, which was shipped into the area and hauled up the hill by a Patrick Malan, M-A-L-A-N Sr., who carried the mortar and brick up from his place on County Line Road, which is actually below this, not that big of a distance away, but it was all hauled up to this construction site. And the mason Lindsay Pike laid all the bricks in this house. It unfortunately burned in 1909. Here's a photograph dating from the 1920s, which is looking the opposite way. We're not going north on Ridge Road here, we're looking south. And actually the rise that you see is from Haviland Brook. You see the bridge sort of in the mid distance there. And then you're looking up the hill that leads you up to the intersection of Chestnut Ridge and Ridge Road. To my knowledge, those farm buildings are no longer there. But what they were doing road maintenance at this time. The county did a lot of bridge repair work in the 1920s. They also actually paved some of these roads, but at this time they were primarily just grading. It's something that had to happen every year. All of the various farmers and property owners would be assessed a certain amount of labor, as well as they'd be asked to provide a team and wagon. And most of the work done in grading the roads was done by hand. You know, they would have to collect gravel from a nearby quarry and haul it by wagon to the road and use it to fill in all of the holes and ruts that occurred during the spring mud season when the road would really be torn up. They also would have a horse-drawn grader that they would use to level the road. And what I find interesting here, you see on the left-hand side, there is a little steam donkey engine, which they would have been using for, I don't know what, but it was something that could be hauled to a site and then used to provide additional power. I included this photograph also, not because it's actually specific to Ridge Road, but it shows something that was absolutely essential in the time period when everybody was still moving about using horses. You needed water. They were animals, and especially in the summer when it was hot, they would need to drink periodically. And so what you'd find along the road here and there were places where there was a spring up the hill, and it allowed you to set up a carved out trough that you see here made out of a log, or they'd have a half a barrel that would be there along the side road, and they'd use wooden pipes to bring the water out to the horse trough. In other places, occasionally there might be a place where rather than going across the bridge, you could just take your horse and wagon right through the stream. The horse got the drink, and the water helped to tighten up your wooden wheels. Here is actually two maps, one that dates from 1876, the lower one, and the upper one actually is an earlier map from 1858, I believe it is. And I've included them here just to point out the area of Oneida. In both these maps, they actually refer to it as Queensbury. It was in the early 19th century a developing area. It rivaled actually Glens Falls at that time with commerce and factories and mills. And what you can see here is that there is a stream running out of what was called then Round Pond. Also came from further to the west from Glen Lake. And where it ran through the area, there were a whole series of mills that were set up, which really contributed to the success of this community. There were also taverns, which perhaps was a draw for people. And what I'm going to do is spend a couple minutes moving back and forth through this area. I just think it's a fascinating story along Ridge Road. If you look at the arrows, since I have them there, I should talk about them. The lower one is showing the intersection of Sunnyside Road and Ridge Road, which is the center of Oneida. And above that, there is an arrow that's pointing at a mill pond that was created in this factory brook, as it was called at the time. And then we're going to spend a moment going off to the east to look at an area that is now referred to as Jenkinsville. And we will also, there's no arrow, but we'll run off to the west to look at a couple places as well. This is what's going to let you know now that you're getting very close to the center of Oneida, Bean Store. In early years, there was a tavern run first by Rouse Winship and later by DeWitt Pitcher that anchored this corner of Oneida. And around 1927, Thurston and Ida Ingraham built a small building there to sell ice cream, candy, gasoline, and tobacco products to summer visitors. This building, which known originally as Barden Store for decades, followed. Of course, now it's Beans. But it's hard to get a sense of it now, but at one time there were stores and taverns on all four corners at this intersection. I failed to mention earlier, where did the name Oneida come from? Well, it came from one of the early residents of this area, Tom Hammond, who was an Oneida Indian who operated a store here in the early 1800s. If we swing east on Sunnyside Road, we'll come to historically what would be called the Seeley House. It's just a very short distance down the road on the north side. Built in 1814 of stone that was hauled to the spot. It is attributed to Reuben Seeley, who was the son of David and Lucy Owens Seeley. The Seeleys were some of the early patentees in both Kingsbury and later Queensbury. And if you go further up the road on the left-hand side, you'll come to the Seeley Cemetery in the Haracena area. So who was Reuben? He was a builder and a lumberman. And at this time period, he actually was running 60 teams of horses that carried lumber between Queensbury and Albany. It's that's an amazing number. He also is credited with building the large stone building in the center of Lake George. There aren't a whole lot of stone buildings around, so whenever you see one, it certainly, in my case, it makes me really curious. And heading a little bit further east, down the hill, and then taking the left at the bottom, is the area of Jenkinsville. And in the 19th century, early 20th century, the Jenkins family operated a fairly large timber operation there. Farmers would bring down their timber that they had harvested on their properties in the winter down to the mill pond that the Jenkins family had created in Factory Creek. And it would be then sawn into lumber, which they could then use for their own construction needs, or they could sell to make a little cash. The Jenkins also operated a grist mill. They also had a cider mill on the location and a blacksmith shop. As I was doing research for this particular talk, I read through the book that Russell Harris wrote about Haracena. And I was just looking for really choice tidbits, descriptions of what life was like as he was told by his parents, grandparents, as well as experiencing himself. And one of the things he mentioned, a strong memory that he had of the creak of the heavy sleighs as they passed by our house on below zero mornings. That's something I can just imagine. If we come back to Oneida Corners and cross over and head west, on the left-hand side is the Oneida School. Another one of the rural schools in Queensbury. And if you go even a little bit further, you come to Weaver's, which was a pavilion that was very popular in the area. It was a place where you could go to swim. They would have big group picnics in a grove there. It was something that people from throughout the area, different groups would meet there. They also sold provisions. And in 1926, Preston and Bessie Carpenter purchased the property, and they did some major improvements. They constructed a locker house where you could get towels, rent lockers and bathing suits even. They added another building, which included a couple of dance halls. And what many people remember is the water slide and the dock that they had there. It was extremely popular on weekends, a place where you could go and enjoy some cool water. Unfortunately, the pavilion burned in 1984. Coming back to the corner is an important building that's still standing. This is the Oneida Grange, or the Mohican Grange. The National Grange of the Order of Patrons of Husbandry was founded in 1867 to encourage families to band together to promote the economic and political well-being of the communities and of agriculture. This Grange was started in 1913. It first met in a house on this location that they converted for that purpose, but they realized they needed a building that would work better for them. So in 1921, they erected the building that is there now. It was the center of social life. People came down from the Haracena area to participate in functions there. There were dinners, meetings, dances. And at one time, there were 7 granges in Warren County. And at its peak, this Grange had over 200 members. Pretty impressive. If you go down the hill, heading north again on Ridge Road, at the bottom, you come to a bridge over Factory Brook. Here's a wonderful old pen and ink sketch of that. Whether it really looked like that, I'm not really sure, but it was certainly a representation of a landmark that was there. There was a chair factory that was located there at one point. There was a woolen factory located in the area as well. We're going to actually drive a ways now because I want you to sort of come with me. We're going to go up and cross over Route 149. And that brings into the area called Haracena, which is where there's another cluster of very interesting buildings. One of the ones that's most notable is the George Brayton House, which is located on the left or the west side. It sort of is up on a knoll. You'll see this wonderful stone wall that's erected across between the house and Ridge Road. And it is best known, it was occupied by many different people, but is perhaps best known as the home for George Washington Brayton. In 1875, George, who was age 42 at the time, lived there with his wife, Caroline Beadleston, who was 37, children Effie, Albert, May, Florence, and Layla, and their servant, Seymour Clements, who was 14. He was had a butcher business in Glens Falls, and they actually relocated to Glens Falls to be closer to his business. While we're here, I want to take a look at buildings that were to either side of the George Brayton house. To the left is a building that probably originally was a tenant house. You can see that it's a much simpler design than George's house. And have a little bit of information about what it was like to be a tenant. Russell Harris wrote that in his time, a farm laborer worked 12 hours from 6 to 6, usually 7 days a week. In exchange for use of the house, they also might make $30 per month. They would have access to all the wood they needed and milk. The building on the right-hand side is the barn, which you can't quite see it through the trees here, but the initials GWB are made out in shingles on the roof. Originally, there were other outbuildings here, which would have been typical for a farm at that time period, but most of them, unfortunately, have burned. Next, on the right-hand side or east side of the road is Haracena Community Church. It was built by John J. Harris for his wife, Louisa, who was a devout woman, who had been teaching Sunday school classes in the nearby Haracena schoolhouse. He was inspired by a church that he saw in Canada, and he hired a builder, imported the stone, which was hauled overland by Horace Hubble, and built this home for his wife to use. The sad part of the story is that he died at age 72 in 1869, right before the chapel was completed, and his funeral was the first service held in the church. Originally Episcopal in its affiliation, the church closed after Louisa's death. And in 1903, in order to preserve the building, it was transferred over to Henry Crandall, and the Crandall Trust took over responsibility for it. Summer services started again in 1918. In 1930, the church became part of the Glens Falls Presbytery. And in 1947, the congregation incorporated as Haracena Community Church, which continues on today. Here is the John J. Harris House, which is almost across the street from the church, just a little bit further on. John J. Harris Sr. Was a relative of Moses Harris, who had acquired and developed the Haracena tract after the Revolutionary War. He built this home as well as the church, which we just looked at. And then his son, also John J., lived there with his family. A subsequent owner was Reuben Ripley, who is best known for Ripley's Point Hotel at the tip of what is now Cleverdale. And locals remember that the Ripleys actually would hold dances here in the summer and kitchen dances inside the house in the winter. Indoor plumbing was rare in this area. Often people would have a spring or they'd have a cistern to collect rainwater. But there were some of these houses located along Ridge Road in this area where they were actually able to bring water down off of the mountain that's to the east. Since some of these houses are located on the opposite side of the street, I don't know if they benefited from that. I don't know how they would pipe it across the road, but it is an interesting part of the story here. Russell Harris recalls a humorous story about one of the Haviland's neighbors, Dan Stark, who supplied milk to Marion House on Lake George. One summer, he began adding water to the milk because he just wasn't producing enough to meet their demand. They caught on and informed him that they would not need to buy more water from him because they had plenty of water available in the lake. A little bit further up the road, where Ridge meets Pickle Hill Road, was the Haracena School. It served 25 to 30 students. Across the lane there, or Pickle Hill Road, was a 6-seat outhouse. I don't have a picture of that. And Russell Harris recalled when he went to school there that it was heated by a wood stove with a black pipe that passed over the teacher's head. The stove held a block of wood 22 inches long. So early every morning, the janitor, who would be hired annually to provide the services, would load the stove, get the fire going, shovel a path to the outhouse, sweep the floor, and dust. Drinking water was stored in a galvanized pail, and students shared a common dipper. It was a privilege for a couple kids each day to collect water from a nearby spring, which I found this part interesting. How's the trout that kept the water clean? What's that for sanitation? So here I don't have a picture of a house. I have a picture of a cow. So how does that relate to Ridge Road? On the Freelon Harris farm, which was located on the west side of the road, just a little further up, Clarence Harris kept Normandy cattle. This is a period image of a Normandy cow. In addition to these cattle, which were raised for their size, he also showed 15 different breeds of fowl at both local fairs and further afield. On one occasion, one of his large bulls escaped, and Clarence later claimed that it must have got out through a little hole in the fence. Well, this is a little different. It's certainly, in its present state, is not one of the outstanding examples of architecture along Ridge Road, but I included it for a reason, because I think it's a wonderful example of the wooden homes that would have been much more common in years past. And as in this one, many of them were not maintained, or they were raised for more modern houses on the same location. In fact, there is a house right behind this one, but I included just so you could get a sense of what the houses were like. Just as in the brick homes or the stone homes that we've seen in the early 19th century, it was very popular to build these Greek Revival homes, which had a very symmetrical layout, a central entrance, same number of windows on each side. You'll notice there's bricks that are located, brick chimneys located at the end of the house. And in this case here, in the early 20th century, it was probably re-sided, and a porch was added on the front, and it has fallen off in recent years. You can see some of the original clapboard, and then another very popular feature that you'll see on these Greek Revival homes, and that is the row of lights or small windows that you see over the door. And then on either side of the door are two wooden carved pilasters that sort of represent the columns that you would have seen on a Greek structure back in classical times. This was the Jenkins Bidwell house. In 1875, it was the home of Almaria Jenkins, his son Lyman and Palmer, daughter-in-law Almaria, and granddaughter Mary. The house was passed on to Palmer Jenkins and subsequently his daughter, who was Minnie Bidwell, who lived here for 75 years. Palmer died at a young age. He was out cutting wood on the mountain behind their house one day, and when he did not return for dinner, his wife and daughter went looking for him, and he had died of a heart attack while timbering. Another thing that you'll notice about this house, which is on the right-hand side, another mile or so after the Havilland houses, there's like an S curve in the road there, and it'll be on your right-hand side. But at that time, people weren't concerned about building houses near the road. It meant they had less to shovel to get to the road, number one. But remember, it was just a dirt lane for many, many, many decades. Now we come to the northern portion of the road. I've included few arrows here. The first area that you'll see there at the bottom, one is pointing to the Union Church, which we'll see in a moment. There's also a school located in this area, which at that time was referred to as Brayton. And then up at the top, sort of at the end of the road, where in Queensbury at least, the road gets up to Catskill Bay. Here's the North Church that I mentioned. The building is standing. The East Lake George Union Sabbath School Society was formed in 1867. The land and lumber for a church building were donated by local residents, and the cornerstone was laid in November of that year. They also built a large parsonage, horse barn, and an academy on the site, none of which are still standing. And it was named for Curtis North of Brooklyn, who was a summer resident who donated the bell for the tower. There's no record of the bronze fish that used to stand atop the steeple there. It was stolen and returned several times and now is in the care of the Lake George Historical Society. Here's a photograph of what is labeled the Cronkite Corner School, and I believe it was actually an early school that was used in the Brayton area. It was later replaced by another one that is still standing, but now a home. Sometimes this was referred to as the Red School, I believe. It's certainly a small building, would not have housed very many students. One of the challenges in this area is how do you get from Ridge Road over to Cleverdale? It's a large marsh, which starts as far south as Haracena, some of the houses we looked at there. And it was pretty impassable at times. And so they did build a bridge here. This is identified as being in the area. I don't believe it's the original bridge, but it gives you an idea of what the terrain was like. And for many years, people used what was called locally the causeway to get from Ridge Road over to Cleverdale. This map here, which is actually from the 1897 topo map, shows you how the road crossed over the marsh. And on the right-hand side is a photo that Russell Harris included in his book. It's the only one I could find that shows the bridge and the built-up causeway that they built across the marsh to get over to the properties and hotels in the Cleverdale area. And Russell Harris mentioned another auditory memory of his. He said that the sound of a vehicle crossing the bridge here could be heard a mile away. Quite a racket. I've included a couple of photographs here just of what Cleverdale was like in the early 20th century. The shoreline was lined with camps, lots of boats. The steamboats would stop at the landings here for the hotels located in the area. It's a big topic all of its own. And I don't have time to get into it tonight, but I just included this as a way to give you a sense of what it was like. In the 1930s, New York State paved Route 9L and completed it from Ridge Road across to the village of Lake George. And here's a wonderful postcard that shows the north end of the road as it's reaching the southeastern end of Lake George. It did require rerouting. In the map that you see in the lower right, I've circled where the original causeway was. That was abandoned and eventually just grown over with vegetation. And it shows you where the Route 9L crosses over the southeastern end of the lake and the marsh there. I mentioned before about how the road for much of its time was just a winding dirt track. Here is a picture of the road as it continues north towards Pilot Knob. The road to Catskill Bay, as the card is labeled. And I'm going to just show a couple of the places that existed in the late 19th century, mid to late 19th century along the road. The first one you'd come to was Tripp-Havilland, which was claimed at the time to be located in one of the best trout fishing areas on Lake George. It began as a log cabin originally built by John Phelps and originally attracted men who would go there to fish. It became more popular and the Tripp-Havilland was built. And in its early days, the primary way to get there was by steamboat. It was easy to get there if you took the train to Lake George and then took the steamboat to their dock. But with the development of Ridge Road and the Catskill Bay Road, it did provide access from the east as well. In fact, they mentioned that you could get there from Hudson Falls by horse and carriage. There were stages as well that would go once or twice a day to the south. In 1862, John Cronkite bought the resort and it stayed in that family for the next 85 years, burned in 1876. The other place that attracted a lot of people was Catskill House, which is, and here you could actually come up Ridge Road, and if you wanted to, ride right out to the steamboat dock there in the lower picture, if you wanted to make a connection there. It was also developed in the mid-19th century. It was operated by the Scoville family starting in about 1880. It had croquet courses, lawn tennis, billiard rooms. It advertised neat apartments and first-class laundry. There were morning and evening boats to Caldwell. But what I found interesting is they also mentioned that from there you could take a lovely ride to Glens Falls, 12 miles distance by Ridge Road. I'm going to end with this image. I need to make sure I credit our funders, the Waldo T. Ross and Ruth S. Ross Charitable Trust Foundation, the town of Queensbury, and particularly this past year, Humanities New York gave us a grant through the Federal CARES Act, funding through the National Endowment for the Humanities. And of course, I want to thank our members and supporters. So I'm leaving a little homework for you. Here's a photograph of a house that is located along the ridge. I'm not telling you exactly where it is because I want you to go out there and find it. I can tell you though that it was known as the home of Major M.F. Smith. We couldn't find out very much about him, but I do know that he was invested in property on Assembly Point and that his son, Warren, had business interests in Ticonderoga. So that's another story where we need to do more research, but I turn it over to you and say, go out on Ridge Road and find some of these places.